Hello, everyone. I'm going to let everybody kind of filter into the program here. I appreciate you so much being with us tonight for our What's Happening in South China Sea program. This is the third program in our What's Happening series, and I appreciate, at least if you're here in Kansas City, taking the time away from this beautiful evening to join us. Again, my name is Evan Verplew. I serve as the program manager of the International Relations Council here in Kansas City. We're very glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact in our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live or viewing the recording later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. One opportunity that has recently come up, we're inviting IRC members to join one or more roundtables. These are a chance to meet and connect with other members, talk about current events in regions of interest to them, and help inform IRC programming. Roundtable members will be invited to a quarterly meeting and receive IRC event information and other updates relevant to the regions they select. Roundtables are open to all members of the IRC, including individual and family members and individuals affiliated with IRC organizational members like businesses, colleges, universities, and nonprofits. Please be involved as your schedule allows without worrying about whether you can make a meeting or meet a deadline. The point is to connect, explore, and engage. More information on those are on our website. With so much going on right now, it's easy to lose track of what's happening around the world, especially in places that have maybe fallen out of the headlines or where news stories are increasingly complicated. We certainly can't predict the future, but we do know the importance of understanding historical background and current global context. No matter of your level of expertise, the What's Happening series offers meaningful explorations on some particularly active parts of the globe. We invite you to deepen your global knowledge and nuance your understanding of what's happening around the world today as we explore what's happening in the South China Sea. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and do check out and share other IRC conversations as we consider a range of critical issues in the coming weeks. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Gregory Hoffman is an adjunct professor in business and entrepreneurship at Webster University, St. Louis, where he has taught in the International MBA program in the areas of ethics, international law, labor management and employment law, corporate social responsibility, and entrepreneurship. Mr. Hoffman has taught at Webster University's main St. Louis campus, as well as campuses in Tampa, Florida, and Shanghai, and Chengdu, China. His working knowledge of written and spoken Mandarin and teaches annually in Webster's international MBA programs in China. In 2017, Mr. Hoffman received Webster University's prestigious Kemper Award for Excellence in Teaching, and he's also been a visiting professor in entrepreneurship at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. Greg, thank you so much for being here this evening. I invite you to please take it away.
Well, thank you, and welcome to everybody who's joining us this evening. We are in for a very, very good program. Let me introduce our speaker, Zhang Jiakwun, or Jack Zhang, as we have come to know him. Jack is an assistant professor in political science at the University of Kansas, and also director of the University of Kansas Trade War Laboratory. He was a 2021-2022 Wilson China Fellow. His research explores the political economy of trade and conflict in East Asia. He was a postdoctoral research fellow in the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance at Princeton University. And he's been the recipient of numerous grants and awards, including the Fulbright U.S. student grant and the Minerva Research Initiative University Research Grant. I have had the opportunity to communicate with Dr. Zhang on more than one occasion. He is exceptional we are in for a treat. We have a lot to learn from him tonight. And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Zhang.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Greg. And hello to everyone for joining us this evening. We have quite a turnout to our KU alumni and friends in the audience. Rock Chalk will have a good, hopefully, week to look forward to here. I'm going to open my remarks with a slide deck, if that's okay, to just give a little bit of an overview of what we'll be talking about here today, and then look forward to having a conversation with Greg and with all of you as well. So I want to preface my remarks when saying that, you know, from Greg's kind introduction, that I'm not an expert in the South China Sea. I don't follow it as closely as I should, but I do teach in my classes at KU. And so what I'd like to offer here today is a little bit of an origin for those who might not be familiar sort of with you know, the origins of the dispute, which are quite complex. And I'm going to root it in the events of World War II and the process of decolonization afterwards. Introduce this idea of why these disputes legally are so complicated through the UN Law of the Sea. Talk a little bit about the economic interests that are at the heart of the dispute, focusing on exclusive economic zones and these completing land reclamation projects, and why those economic interests have garnered sort of and become zero sum and garnered sort of militarization, securitization, which is where the U.S. sort of has been involved in recent years, right? Since 2015 in particular, through freedom of navigation operations, and what it means for the larger U.S.-China relationship and security dynamics in the region. And then I'll conclude by talking about some recent developments, including sort of progress towards a code of conduct. So this is a map of the South China Sea. You know, you have China to the north, right? You have Vietnam to the west, the Philippines to the east, Malaysia to the south as the major claimants. Other claimants involved include Taiwan, Brunei, increasingly also Indonesia. And in the various lines here and dots, right, quite a complicated map, and we'll unpack it a little bit, right, shows sort of the various claims, right, the various countries have, the islands that are under their control, which are the islands have airstrips, and these big sort of zones that you see highlighted in the solid lines that overlap, right? At the end of the day, this is the reason we have this conflict, is these overlapping sort of jurisdictions and that dotted line, the 9-dash line of China's claims in the region, right? So this is where we are geographically. And, you know, to simplify the map a little bit, right, the conflicts of the South China Sea are really over two big clusters of islands that have different dynamics involved, right? In the north, you have the Paracel Islands, which are disputed between basically just China and Vietnam. Taiwan also involved sort of historically, right? We'll talk about that in a little bit. But those are almost all under Chinese control. That happened during and sort of towards the end of the Vietnam War. And then to the south, we have a much more complicated situation of the Spratly Island chains, where, you know, all the players are involved in competing claims, right? Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, China, Taiwan, Brunei, Indonesia, all of these, right? And you can see the control, right, effective control that are shown on the map in the various colors overlap, right? So this is a cluster where very close to each other, right? Different governments control different pieces of territory. And so the nature of the conflict is a little bit different, right? Between the Paracels and the Spratlys. And, you know, in terms of origins, you know, there's a sense, right, you know, in the media, oftentimes, you know, South China Sea disputes in other parts of the world that's maybe not, you know, featured closely in our textbooks are described as sort of these like eternal, sort of long-running, centuries-long disputes and battles. And, you know, the claimants that are involved oftentimes do evoke sort of ancient history in order to justify their claims. But I want to disabuse you of that notion, right? And make it clear that the origins of these disputes date back to, within, almost past one lifetime, but in the 1940s, right? Within certainly living memory, right? Recorded history here. And they really have to do with this map that I'm showing here, right? The fact that you had, prior to this, right? Prior to 1940, Japanese imperial expansion, European colonial powers controlled most of the claimants, right, that are abutting the South China Sea. You had the French in Indochina, you had the British in Malaya, so that's Malaysia and the Philippines, and Singapore, the Americans in the Philippines. The South China Sea was not really an issue, to the point where, the various European powers that mapped and surveyed the region, they even exchanged, swapped sort of effective control over the islands. They were not particularly economically valuable, not strategically or militarily important. There was no issue, no dispute really over sort of these 250 or so specks of rock in the South China Sea. Then along come the Japanese sort of empire, particularly in the 1930s, right, expanding southwards. And so by 1940, Japan kicks out the French from Indochina, the British from Malaya, and the Americans from the Philippines, and establishes sort of control, making South China Sea a Japanese lake, right, for a brief period of time. Then, right, the alliance of, the allies, including, right, at this time, the Republic of China, right, working with the United States, rolls back Japanese imperial gains. And by 1945, the war is over, and the story of the South China Sea disputes really began with who takes surrender, right, of Japanese forces across this vast theater of the Pacific, right? And it was decided that the Republic of China, right, as one of the victorious allies under Chiang Kai-shek, right, would take surrender of Japanese troops, not only in China and the Chinese mainland, but also in French Indochina as well. In this period of time, the ROC, the claims, right, the 9-dash line that you probably read about in the paper really dates back to this claim, right? There were some survey efforts prior to that in the 1930s, but the credibility or legitimacy of China's claims, and this is the Republic of China's claims, right, stem back to this period where under the Republic of China, which is now in Taiwan, right, effectively sort of projecting military force, taking surrender of Japanese troops, and occupying some of the key islands during this process, right? And after World War II and the success of Japanese forces in kicking out some of these colonial governments, right, that spawned deep dissatisfaction, right, with colonial rule. And quickly after the end of World War II, you had a wave of decolonization, independence movements in Vietnam in 1945, right, North Vietnam there, in Malaysia and Singapore coming to being in 1957, Dutch East Indies, 1945, Philippines in 1946, Taiwan, which was under Japanese rule since 1895, reverting back to Chinese control with the Republic of China. Why does this all of this matter, right? It's that none of these new governments that were established had any say over territorial claims, right, that were made and agreed upon in treaties that were made prior to this point, right? And all of them come in with a nationalist mandate, and these competing claims, and the feeling that various governments, whatever arrangements were made about who controls territory in this period of time prior, doesn't count, right? Because we have new people in charge, and these governments are seen as more legitimate, right, than the previous governments that predated them, that made those treaties that divided up whatever territory in the way that they see. And this is, a pattern that we see with decolonization and as a root of conflict right across the world, right? That's part one. World War I, decolonization, defeat of Japan. That's only half of the story. The other half of the story comes in with the UN Law of the Sea, UNCLOS for short, which comes into effect. It was negotiated in the 1970s, comes into effect in 1994. And this is probably why, like, if you were paying attention and saw headlines about the South China Sea at all, it was not before this period of time, right? Before this law came into being. And the reason for this, kind of ironically, is the reason countries, 150 have ratified UNCLOS is to avoid territorial conflict by basically delineating who controls resources and access to the sea, which, up until this point, right, the conventions of the Law of the Sea was more like if you can project military force in there, you control it. If you're within cannon shot range, literally that was the rule. If you're within cannon shot range of about 3 nautical miles, that's what you control. And beyond that is open water, right? Anybody can operate and do anything that they want. And as the world became more interdependent and globalized, and there's a lot more activity that you can have offshore, including the exploration for natural resources, right? This became problematic. And so countries came together to try to come out with a way to delineate territorial control in the same way that we have territorial divisions on land to try to avoid conflict. The idea of good fences making good neighbors. And the rules that they came up with, I'm not a legal expert, but this is my understanding of it, right, is that from your controlled land and the continental shelf, you're able to project out 12 nautical miles of territorial water, where you have the ability to exclude other countries and military and commercial activity. Then you get another contiguous zone of 12 nautical miles where you still get to apply the country of the country the laws that apply on land, but with some provisions about like peaceful transit and things like that. And then beyond that, and this is where things get tricky, is you get a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone in which the country is supposed to control all natural resources, including fishing, mining, and oil exploration, right? And the South China Sea disputes are all about these EEZs, exclusive economic zones, right? Not so much about the territorial waters. So here I show you 2 figures, right? The lines of the territorial waters minus the 9-dash line, which is sort of a separate, more expansive kind of claim we can talk about later, right? But with the exception of the 9-dash line, right, there's not really overlapping control or jurisdiction disputes over territorial waters here, right? But if you look at the map on the right, these show the overlapping claims of the exclusive economic zones. And this is where, right, they get really messy, right? They are a tangled mess in the South China Sea, right? And the reason why, right, control over these rocks, right, that are uninhabitable in the sea stems back also to how UNCLOS is written, I think an unintended sort of consequence, right? So islands, if you control islands, right, they grant you territorial sea and contiguous zone access, but more importantly, they allow you to control this 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, including islands that you have pretty far away from your coast. So here I have a picture showing, this is not in the South China Sea, it's a Japanese island, right, in further north, but you can see it's basically like a manhole cover that's exposed in the sea, right? It is completely useless for basically anything, except that it grants Japan a 200 nautical mile radius exclusive economic zone in the middle of the Pacific Ocean where it can explore for natural resources. You see that oil rig on the side there, right? And so all the competing sort of claimants in the South China Sea have this incentive, right, to assert control over rocks and islands that they previously, could care less about, in order to grant them not only the sort of territorial sort of claims, but more importantly, the exclusive economic zone and the control over natural resources that are part of this. And part of the reason you get land reclamation as well is, low tide elevations, meaning that at high tide, the thing is submerged below water, don't give you the same entitlements under UNCLOS. And so there's a perverse incentive then to make stuff that would be submerged normally pop out above water at all times, make them islands, and then be able to control additional territory, right? And so this gets us to then why do we have these disputes in the South China Sea in the first place? And this figure on the right sort of lays out the numbers, right? You got an estimate about 11 billion barrels of natural gas, predominantly underneath the sea. That's estimated. You have some large amount of fishery stock that's very dependent on this, and then you have some number of inhabitable islands that you can potentially put runways on and militarize, right? But the map on the left shows these are the competing sort of claims, and also who controls which oil blocks right now, like the national exploration for undersea natural resources, predominantly the 2 most active claimants are the competing claims in China and Vietnam. Vietnam in green here, China in blue, over these resources, right? By far, the thing that matters probably the most is the stuff that's underneath the sea, the $11 billion worth of gas. You also have the picture of the ship, which I like, right? There's, you may have seen in the headline that South China Sea is one of the busiest shipping routes, I think the second busiest in the world, something like, over half, I believe, of Chinese, nearly half of Chinese goods exports go through there, good portion of imports go through there, particularly oil from the Middle East. But I think it's actually a sort of a red herring to focus on sort of the importance, right, of control over the South China Sea for commerce, right? The reasons are that unless you escalate to war, right, and even if you get to that point, right, it's very rare that you have civilian shipping sort of heavily impacted. Like there's some amount of freighter traffic still happening despite the Ukraine sort of Russia war. And short of war, which is most of the time that we live in, right, there's no real sort of incentives and no real sort of ability to control sort of transits. And there are these strategic straits, predominantly the Malacca Strait and the Lombok Strait, that figures really prominently for China's strategic thinking about why the South China Sea is important, right? They worried about the so-called Malacca problem Chinese military strategists have for a while, which is, the fact that so much of Chinese trade goes through there, and a lot of energy imports, which is essential for waging war, comes through there as well. And if you didn't have access to that, then, potentially, right, you could be embargoed and, be at a disadvantage in military conflicts that you would otherwise, feel like you could win, right? But I think that strategic thinking, which is very China-centric, has now entered sort of the wider global discourse about this, that other countries, right, and especially the United States, have some sort of concern about, right, the transit of trade through the South China Sea. I don't think that is the primary sort of concern here, right? It's very difficult to restrict that flow of traffic. If it happens, it'll only happen in war times, and if war times are already happening, then it puts us sort of in a different sort of category of events, right? So it's the stuff underneath the sea that I think drives the conflict, not so much the stuff sort of above, not so much, again, in reality, the issues of transit and safe transit through the area. Where it gets militarily important and complicated are the acceleration of land reclamation efforts. And so the map on the left shows actually all the non-China sort of land reclamation sort of efforts. A lot of these predate the 2010s, and some of it goes all the way back, like Ituaba, the Republic of China, Taiwan seized that during World War II. Right, in the South China Sea, for various reasons, there's some amount of land reclamation that predated this. But you can see on the figure on the right that China's efforts at land reclamation accelerating after 2015 just dwarfs all the other claimants and their actions over the past couple of decades, right? The scale and the sort of the extent of some of these new islands is unprecedented, and they matter, I think, less sort of for the economics reasons, although they also are helpful in projecting, whatever, legitimizing those kind of claims of 200 nautical miles. But primarily what China has done with some of these, which is put runways and, according to open source of military intelligence, putting SAM sites and anti-air capabilities and anti-ship capabilities on some of these islands. Right, so the real concern, less so, again, the restriction of civilian shipping, particularly like American or European civilian shipping, but right, as a front in then the ability for the U.S. to project military power into this sort of vital region of the world where many American allies, right, are in existence. So as a result, I think primarily because of that military dimension, right, the fact that I think economics drove sort of this land rush in the South China Sea, and then China saw itself as sort of other actors is acting, sort of getting the first move and starting some of this land reclamation, and then getting invested in a really, really major way, right? So from economic stuff, we get to military stuff, and then putting some, capabilities on these islands. The U.S. gets involved, particularly after 2015. Here's a table of U.S. freedom of navigation operations, right? And these operations involve sailing a warship basically through, right, the 12 nautical mile, right, territorial water radius of some of these new features, right, like Mistress Reef or Firecross Reef that China has reclaimed, right? Because technically, before you build an island on it, the thing was submerged half of the time. And so it shouldn't entitle you to 12 nautical miles. Therefore, the normal sort of open law of the sea transit should apply, right? And the US should be able to, and any other power should be able to sail military vessels through these things. China, because it claims that these things are not low tide elevations, but an island, right, would say that these are unlawful. And so you have some of these standoffs, right, where, Chinese ship would say, don't come in, and the US ship would say, okay, we're coming in because this is, right, this is international waters. And then, we had a few sort of close encounters, right, fortunately, right, no shots fired, no casualties as a result of these yet, right? But this is the logic why the US is doing this, right? Why do you sail, right, ships up next to islands that, right, that don't really mean a whole lot, is because of contesting the principle, right, the legality of it, right, that these, from US perspective, are not generating territorial waters, and that the things that China is doing on it, especially putting military installations, are illegitimate, right? And so, this is where we get into sort of this, as the US is sort of pulled in, the larger context of Chinese power projection and growth and rise in Asia on the one hand, right, and the US response on another. This is a nice figure that shows China's expansion and increasing presence in the South China Sea. And there's a predictable pattern here, which is every time that there's a sort of a power vacuum, right? The first power vacuum of Japan being kicked out, right? The second being sort of the US withdrawing from Vietnam. The third being the Soviets, sort of because of internal sort of dynamics and rapprochement with the US, diminishing sort of their support for Vietnam. And then more recently, prior to 2015, right, with the war on terror, the US really shifted its attention away from Asia in general, but also in Asia, the focus is on counterterrorism. And so you didn't, there was perceived to be these windows of opportunity. From a international relations perspective, China has, in each of these windows, right, expanded its presence and territorial claims in this vital sort of water area. Okay, and that brings us up to today, right, where the South China Sea, its primary importance, right, I would say, is ironically, right, the claimants in Asia care about the South China Sea for economic reasons the most. The reason it's now become important is not for economic reasons, but for security reasons, in that it is one of the areas of the world where a conflict between the US and China, the two world's largest economies, most powerful militaries, both armed with nuclear weapons, could actually occur, right? And it's part of this cat and mouse game of China developing what are called A2AD, anti-access, anti-area denial capabilities like missiles and cruise missiles primarily, submarines, to try to be able to contest the US sort of close to the Chinese border and prevent US power projection close to the Chinese mainland. And now with the installation of runways and missiles in some of these South China Sea features, the worry is that it will become a lot more costly for the US to then operate, right? And here shown in red are those lines of Chinese power projection. Shown in blue are US allies and the range of a US carrier battle group, right? And it's assorted, it's sort of complements of aircraft and then the weapons that are on the aircraft, right? Which is pretty large, right, in the region. We now see the increasing sort of changes of doctrine on either sides, where China would like to make sure that the carrier battle group cannot operate within what's called the first island chain, which is going from like Japan down to Taiwan through the Philippines, right? And the US would very much like to have freedom of maneuver, especially to be able to project power and come to assistance of allies that are within that, within the range of these new Chinese capabilities. And so the South China Sea really, important first and foremost for this risk, right? That as, for either side, the nature of the security dilemma is, right, there are actions that you take, right, as a country that you think are enhancing your security, right, are defensive sort of in nature, right? that then causes security concerns and worries for your neighbors and for for other countries, and then causes them to then arm and develop capabilities to overcome those capabilities that you put into place. That's exactly what we see here, right? China putting in capabilities to try to deny U.S. Power projection ability, particularly around the Taiwan Strait, and the U.S. developing new capabilities to try to go beyond that. And now we see, right, the danger of that potentially spiraling out of control, either in the form of arms racing, right, or more wordly, sort of in a unintended sort of clash that then may escalate into wider sort of conflict, right? Where this thing ends is very unclear, right? Because every action that you take that try to make you more secure makes the other side feel less secure, and you end up in this terrible sort of predicament, right? So that's gloomy, right? And I don't know if this is necessarily sort of more cheerful or better, right? But it's certainly in a different direction, right? So we talked about the economic, we talked about the military. Conclude by talking a little bit about the international, diplomatic, and legal sort of progress here, right? Historically, China has been opposed to negotiating sort of a collective agreement or code of conduct in the South China Sea, and it preferred to negotiate bilaterally. And this makes sense because every other claimant is much smaller, both militarily and economically, compared to China, and so China would like to have the most favorable terms in working out some sort of thing, and legally binding code of conduct would run against that. Most famously, in 2002, there was an effort as this South China Sea land grab was getting underway to try to come to negotiations for a code of conduct, or at least principles for a code of conduct. There essentially was watered down, right? There were essentially these principles about peaceful resolution and self-restraint that were agreed upon, but in a non-binding way, right? Fast forward 10 years, as this issue lingers, right? South China kind of drops in and out of US headlines, right? But for countries that are in the region, it's pretty important. For if you're in that, abutting that body of water, it's one of the most important foreign policy issues that you have. And so 10 years later, there was an effort among the ASEAN ministers to try to get some language about UNCLOS and a code of conduct or a promise to demilitarize sort of the region into and how to navigate these disputes over EEZs into some sort of ministerial statement out of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Countries. Many of their members, right, are involved in this dispute. But it was almost sort of unilaterally blocked by Cambodia, and there's been a lot of interesting research and journalism about sort of Cambodia being bought off, basically, and offered a bunch of development aid and things like that in order, to torpedo sort of this effort, right, driven by Vietnam and the Philippines to try to get something. ASEAN's a consensus-driven body, and so it didn't get anywhere as a result of this. So the conflict sort of gets worse and escalates, and there were several militarized disputes throughout the late 2010s, and especially sort of prominent one involving China and the Philippines in the Scarborough Shoal in, I think, like 2014, I believe, right? And so the Philippines takes this to becomes the first country to take this to a tribunal that was set up by UNCLOS. In 2016, this tribunal issues a ruling that invalidates China's sort of 9-line claims as incompatible with UNCLOS and the understanding of what constitutes sort of legitimate territorial claims under UNCLOS. And China didn't participate in the process, refused to send any information, called the thing illegitimate, and refused to abide, even though it's a signatory of UNCLOS, refused to abide by the court's rulings. And the court doesn't have any kind of, right, the difference between a court in a domestic context and a court in international law is that there's no international law enforcement, right, that will honor the ruling of said court. So nonetheless, you get this ruling, and it did something, right? It's not China's position after 2016. You can see a notable sort of shift in that it made the move that it would prefer to negotiate some sort of framework and move towards a code of conduct negotiation with ASEAN, right? which was something that it resisted for the previous sort of 2 decades. And you saw sort of incremental progress towards some of this. The final language is still not out, and it's been delayed in some ways because of COVID, where a lot of these meetings that were supposed to happen by 2020 didn't happen. But the reason for this and the larger strategy for China was, to couple sort of the South China Sea issues with the charm offensive and economic inducement sort of campaign, including Belt and Road projects and, terms of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, that were being negotiated around the same time. And I think try to use, again, that asymmetric sort of advantage vis-a-vis each of these member state ASEAN countries, which are all large trade partners, larger trade partners with China than anywhere else in the world. ASEAN is the largest single sort of trading bloc with China, second, then the EU, and then third is the United States, right, vis-a-vis sort of China trade. And so there's a lot of economic interest tied in these countries. And so the relative importance or salience of the South China Sea issue is something that is up to debate in domestic politics, right? That's another thing that I think you don't necessarily get from following the news coverage from a U.S. perspective, right? Is that it's kind of contentious about how important these goodies are, right? Trade and integration with China versus again the claims and even the natural resources that go with the claims there. And so I think China, after the 2016 tribunal ruling, realized that maybe it overreached sort of in that period prior, and is trying to work out something with ASEAN that excludes the United States, right? So one key feature here is that China is negotiating with ASEAN. The US doesn't get to be involved and doesn't have a say in this. And so if it can get to a code of conduct, it can shape whatever that language will look like, right? And so we'll see what that will be. And the US, right, would have to do the same thing, but not in the room, right? Have to coordinate pretty closely with these member states. And we can talk about in Q&A whether that's happening or not. But it's a much harder sort of diplomatic game, right? So that's where we are, I think, today. So I will end there and look forward to your questions. We'll chat with take some questions from Greg as well.
Okay, Dr. Zhang, thank you very much. That was very interesting, and of course points out the confusion that we have in the South China Sea that isn't necessarily clear to us simply reading US news or listening to US television. Before I get us started, I would like to ask our audience, because we do have a number of people, this is your presentation. It's your opportunity to talk with and ask questions of Dr. Zhang. So please use the Q&A section of your Zoom call and send questions, and we will direct some of those to Dr. Zhang. I'll get us started, but let's hear from you all as well. Dr. Zhang, I have a question, and it goes to UN CLOS, the Conference on the Law of the Sea. It's clear that the 2016 decision of the Hague Tribunal said the 9-dash line, we don't care what happened in the 1940s, it doesn't matter anymore, it's meaningless. China chose not to participate in that proceeding. It chose, when the ruling came out, to basically condemn the ruling as a farce. Those are the things I read. But I'm wondering two questions. One, what were the basic arguments? Because of course, China was a signatory to the Conference on the Law of the Sea. And two, is this change that you're seeing now, this sort of turn where China may be trying to work something out, is that driven more militarily, or is it driven more by the BRI and the Maritime Silk Road projects that China has just, I mean, they've put all their weight behind that?
Yeah, thank you, Greg. That's a really excellent question. And not being sort of there's two ways to answer it, and one would be sort of the legal route, and one is the international relations route. Seeing that I'm not a lawyer and an IR scholar, I'll skip over sort of legal arguments. So the claims that China makes is basically that its domestic law should have precedence over international law, and therefore, however you interpret those things, like the non-national line is still legitimate, and the international law sort of is not. But I think the larger sort of question that you hit on is right, which is, international law exists in this space, right, where it is up to then the international community to come together and decide and determine and enforce them and make them binding. And there's not a whole lot of ability to do that currently, and it's importantly undermined by one key dimension, which is the U.S. is not a signatory of UNCLOS. And this comes up repeatedly, right, in international fora. And, until the Senate ratifies this thing, which the U.S. was instrumental in negotiating, right, the U.S. will face this sort of dilemma of like, well, you can't claim exceptionalism, right, in one case and then tell other countries that you have to, right, you have to abide by these in another case. It also means that the U.S. can't credibly use its military and economic sort of power to try to enforce these things when it itself does not want to be bound by this, right? And so that opens up a whole other set of debates about like, where sovereignty and U.S. power projection is limited and whether it's going to benefit or not from ratifying UNCLOS. I tend to think that U.S. would be better off, right, by enforcing UNCLOS, even though it might restrain the U.S. ability to operate in some ways. It is, the benefits that you will get in places like the Arctic, actually, and also South China Sea, and U.S. being then a credible sort of arbiter in some of these disputes would be greater, right? That's the answer, part one of your question. I think in IR perspective, it's that the U.S. haven't ratified UNCLOS. It's the most powerful outside actor in this game. It can't play as active of a role in adjudication. So instead it's what started under Obama, escalated sort of under Trump, and is continuing under Biden, is greater U.S. power projection into the region to try to tip the balance another way. So the second part of your question was, about really the sorry, I lost my train of thought. Could you remind me of the second part of the question? That was the first one was like the legal thing. The second one is.
Yeah, the second part of the question was, China has made some turn towards trying to find solutions to the South China Sea, albeit nobody's agreed to anything yet. And I'm wondering if that is really primarily a function, as the US might say, it's a function of military control, but as China might say, it's a function of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road, which they have put so much energy and effort into. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all excellent points. And I think it's not an either or, right, but like a yes and thing, right? So from China's perspective, the worst thing that can happen in the South China Sea, right, is for ASEAN to come together and, take a position that is consistent with U.S. sort of positions, or increase sort of the U.S. presence in the region and exclude China, right, to form sort of an anti sort of China bloc. And ASEAN is not quite, not there yet, and actually I would say fairly far from that, given the economic interests, right? So, Belt and Road serves economic interests, but it also serves the linkage, right, in holding these countries and their national interests close, having them aligned with Chinese interests in some ways in the region, right? And I think the other part is, right, the worry after, I think, 2016 and really the backlash across the region, and also with the US getting more involved. I think China was worried that, like, if it didn't at least make a move, right, to be conciliatory, that it might be shut out, and some kind of agreement would be made, right, that will make ASEAN more unified and more sort of solidly in the US bloc, right? And so they're intertwined, right? The economic stuff enforces sort of political goals in the South China Sea, to have, to essentially keep Chinese claims sort of alive and divide ASEAN, and to keep the US, to minimize US influence in the region.
Interesting. Erica Benson has asked an interesting question that ties into a question that I also have. So I will combine our questions, and that deals with the Philippines and the Philippines' reaction to China's building, its claims, etc. And I want to suggest it was reported this morning in the the South China Morning Post that the Philippine government possibly will make some claim against the Chinese with regard to Coast Guard shipping or ships near the Scarborough Shoal off of the Philippines. And there apparently were movements made by the Coast Guard cutters of the Chinese Navy that blocked and made it impossible for the Philippine Coast Guard to have direct access to areas that it might wish to go outside of the Scarborough Shoal. How does the Philippines look at the Scarborough Shoal? It seems to be an extremely critical issue. And then a second question, nobody's agreed on anything really in the South China Sea. But when you have these incidents, like Coast Guard cutters blocking each other, are there other agreements or some types of systems that have been put in place? Are the admirals and generals able to talk to each other before anything may become more serious militarily in those areas?
Great, thank you. And thank you, Erica, for your question. So two parts again. The first part about the Philippines stands, of course, the Philippines sees Scarborough Shoal, which actually on the map, it's not in Spratly, it's not in the parasol, it's actually really close to the Philippines, as you know, a territorial sort of, you know, clearly sort of Philippines territorial, you know, sovereign territory. And so, yeah, there's not a, there's an unambiguous sort of relationship there, an unambiguous relationship in that the Philippines doesn't support any of China's claims in the South China Sea as one of the disputants, right? But to Greg's question, it is, the Philippines is also emblematic, right, of the complex, ambiguous sort of, and in many cases, right, going with domestic politics, vacillating position of a lot of Southeast Asian governments, right, between China and the U.S., right? So the Philippines was the site of one of the largest U.S. naval bases in the world, right, during the Vietnam War. A lot of the for domestic political forces, that Subic Bay was shut down, right, and the U.S. has a much diminished role in the Philippines in the decades leading up to the conflict in Scarborough. And then that conflict sort of happened. That government that presided over the Scarborough Shoal sort of dispute, where the Philippines really was outmuscled, right, by Chinese forces. Where important to realize, the Philippines Navy, I think their largest ship is smaller than the average Chinese Coast Guard cutter, right? So it's a massive power asymmetry, right? And so they couldn't, you know, they took a loss there militarily. They went to the tribunal. That government is out of power. Duterte came in and initially had this more sort of China position, aired towards the pro-Beijing position. And so it swung back and forth, right? Because the Philippines' interests and many of the countries in Southeast Asia's interests are complicated. They don't, I don't think, fundamentally want to have to choose between wealth and commerce with China on the one hand and security and the U.S. alliance on the other, or U.S. friendship, right, in cases like Vietnam. And so that is at the heart of this, right, is that and I think frustrating for U.S. diplomats to have to deal with, right, is that, you know, these countries' positions seem to change, certainly with governments, and even the same administration can have, you know, different approaches, right? And I think that's connected to your second question, and you know, the fundamental fact is that for all the countries in the South China Sea, right, and that are major players, the U.S. is the only one that has a choice about whether to live in the South China Sea or whether to be in the South China Sea or not. All the other countries are there and they're stuck there, right? And you know, for the time being, the belief would be that China is going to be there and it's going to be this big market. It's going to have a big military, and so you can't, right? Winning, you know, they're looking in the long-term sort of interests of these of their own countries, and that makes it hard to take, you know, what from either the U.S. or Chinese perspective would be a clean decision. That means that things like what Greg was asking about, you actually have a lot of, as these disputes are happening, you have some things like joint exploration that's been talked about. You certainly have hotlines between the militaries and, joint military exercises between some of these players in China, and certainly between many of these the players in the area and the United States, right? And so, a lot of that is happening because it's in the common interest, I think, for many of the South China Sea, all the South China Sea disputants, to basically manage conflict, conflict escalation, to make sure that doesn't happen accidentally, right? That you don't end up in an embarrassing and dangerous situation where, God forbid, right, you have loss of life, and then the governments will have to do something about it that they didn't want to do in the first place. They want to be in control of the situation. And so it's a really complicated game. But yeah, all of those things are happening behind the scenes, including, interestingly, Vietnam and China have the most, I think, like mill-to-mill interactions and exchanges. And I think they, in 2020, there was a new conflict management system put into place that was negotiated, right? It's the most active dispute, and yet it's also trying to, right, manage this thing. So that subtlety, I think, in the on the part of the ASEAN claimants in the South China Sea needs to be something that we recognize here when thinking about the region.
Thank you. It is interesting because the Scarborough Shoal exists both in the Philippines claimed territory and the 9 dash line territory. And now the U.S. post-COVID is about to start a major military maneuver and I forget what they call it, but like practice in Luzon, which is very close to the Scarborough Shoal. So how the parties choose to communicate with each other is of concern. You've talked a lot about ASEAN or ASEAN, however people like to pronounce it, and I have a question for you because it ties back to where we're coming from as U.S. citizens and what we understand and what our government's policies may be. We know that there is a group of countries in Southeast Asia that make up the ASEAN contingent. Since the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, the U.S. has, of course, been very, very focused on ASEAN. And by the way, guys, China's about to do the same thing in Taiwan. So you need to come together and you need to work with us and we need to move forward as a group. That being said, there were meetings scheduled with the US and ASEAN that were to start today in Washington, D.C., and they were canceled. And there's some suggestion, if you read the Chinese newspapers, both mainland and non-mainland, that there is irritation with the US over a number of issues, but not the least of which is a lack of understanding that the ASEAN countries have a stronger economic connection and tie to China than many do to the United States. And certainly militarily, they can't defeat China, but they want to keep the peace, if you will. With all of that in mind, what would we expect to see? And what are you hearing in terms of the US position in the South China Sea, how it's going to continue to deal with ASEAN, which does not appear to be a group that is easy to corral. It's not as easy as it has been for Europe to come together vis-a-vis Ukraine. And what do you see happening with the competing interests of ASEAN, the United States, and China in the South China Sea? It's kind of a loaded big question, but
yeah, boy, that is a big question. It's a tough one. I'll try to take it apart. So I think the thing to recognize is that, right, ASEAN is a group of sort of middle powers trapped between the US and China and this growing geopolitical competition, right, have both potential sort of upsides and huge potential downsides, right? And so they ideally would like to get along with both sets of countries, which is really, that you could say that, between 1990s to the early 2010s, right, this characterized the dynamics in the region, right, that they were able to benefit from, US to trade with both U.S. and China, to militarily cooperate, buy weapons from whoever you want in the region, right? The U.S. didn't really put a great focus on on diplomatic engagement in the region, to the criticism of folks who focus and study the region, right? Ever since the Vietnam War, right, Southeast Asia went from top priority in national security and foreign policy to one of the lowest, right, for a number of years. And it's regained in importance as a consequence of this growing rivalry with China, right? And that has some positive sort of upsides, right, for the nations involved, but it also involves these downsides of no ASEAN country wants to be on the front lines and be the first one that gets shot at, right, by Chinese forces for interests that are not, it's not seen as sort of central to its own. Taiwan would be one of those, right? I think many people probably would want peaceful resolution, continuing status quo on the Taiwan issue, but no ASEAN country is going to try to cross China and suffer potentially economic coercion and sanctions for unclear benefits, right, from the United States, right? And so going back to some, what you talked about earlier with Belt and Road, right? I mean, for the US to be engaged in the region, it needs to offer not only a security alternative to China, which it very much has, right? I mean, US has more bases, better sort of ability to project power and better weapons to offer. It's not that, right? It needs to also offer an economic alternative. And there's been some efforts to try to do that under the Trump administration. Some efforts started, trying to cooperate more economically with Vietnam. But they're pretty limited, right? And there's nothing on the scale that would tip the balance and make countries feel comfortable shifting aside and being there. And I think you do mention, right, Europe coming together and so forth, but until the Ukraine war happened, right, the US faced many of the same problems in Europe, right, of European allies having different interests vis-a-vis China, but especially vis-a-vis Germany, vis-a-vis Russia, right, Germany and Russia, and not wanting to really, not wanting to sacrifice your economic interests for some sort of future security interests. And a war on your border has that concentrating effect, right? And I think, what we want to look out for, right, is, in the unfortunate occurrence of a major crisis or a militarized crisis that escalates to large numbers of casualties, whether the U.S. will, in the lead up to that and maybe in the aftermath of that, be able to play a similar sort of leadership role, right, and align interests, of ASEAN players in a similar way. That would be in some ways China's worst nightmare if that were to happen, and which is why I think some of these efforts to try to work out a code of conduct and prevent that from happening is underway right now, right? But to manage this complicated situation, I think requires concerted diplomatic attention and engagement, right? Even if the U.S. is not in the room in negotiations, to have that be happening, and that's a tall order, right? We need to be able to have people on the ground, ambassadors sort of approved for this effort to sort of continue.
Okay, well, let me ask one final question. We're of course American students, so we need three of something. So what would you say would be three takeaways for us as Americans and as Kansas Cityans to better understand and also to be thinking about in the future with regard to the issues in the South China Sea?
Yeah, what an excellent question. So I also see, so before I address that, there's a question by an anonymous attendee. I'm sorry if I gave out the impression that Indonesia is not an actual country. Of course, it's an actual country. It is not within the 9-dash line claims originally, but in recent years, the Tuna Island disputes have entered into concern for Indonesia. So that's why it's not one of the on the Economist map of claimants in the South China Sea. But to Greg's excellent question about three takeaways, I would say, I think the first is, I think the U.S. really should think hard, and there should be a robust discussion about UNCLOS. And the opposition for ratification of UNCLOS comes primarily from Republican senators, and we have a couple of those in Missouri. So, if you care about this issue, to look into it and judge for yourself whether it's to the U.S. interest to ratify UNCLOS or not, whether some surrender of sovereignty to this international body would be, that the cost would be justified by the policy benefits, which I think I and many international relations scholars believe that it will. Right, that will give U.S. a lot of credibility in, I think, adjudicating again a good and equitable sort of settlement for the region. The second, I think, is to not think about, to realize is, I mean, much of our discussion is been about ASEAN countries and the various claimants, right? To see them not as pawns in this great game, right, and maneuvered by either China or the U.S., but as countries that have their own histories and their own interests that sometimes are aligned with U.S. interests and sometimes are not, right? And to, recognize that fact, right, because that's not something that's going to change, and construct, right, and for a support foreign policies that is consistent with that reality rather than something that we wish to be true, right? Some, either some grand coalition, right, or, right, in some ways what we're seeing now, right, the original sort of error, I would say, of the Cold War was this belief of domino theory that got the US involved in this war in Vietnam that I think most would agree was a mistake, right? We don't want to repeat those kind of mistakes and believe that countries are sort of these lack autonomy and are these blocks that are going to sway one way or another, but realize, their interests and their politics and make policy based on that reality would be one. And then the third is, stepping away and to the larger significance of the South China Sea, right? We are in a period of really the worst, right, the most fraught, dangerous period of U.S.-China relations, in living memory, certainly in the last 50 plus years. And the South China Sea is one dimension of it. It's not the only not the only one, right? But to be, I guess, aware of that and the fact that a lot of these issues that you'll read about, right, that seem maybe there could be a clear black and white sort of answer if you just believe that everything that China wants, right, if the U.S. takes a position against whatever China wants, right, that would be good foreign policy, right? That kind of thinking, I think, is potentially very, very dangerous, right? When applied to this situation, right, you judge for yourself sort of the facts on the ground, right? But to take an unequivocal sort of position in this complex dispute, I don't think would be to the U.S. national interest. And similarly, for what I study, in the trade war, follows very much of that pattern, right? The costs of fighting and confrontation and the ends may not sort of, are not necessarily good and probably won't justify the means, right? So even if you believe, right, in which I do, right, that 9-dash line, right, UNCLOS's rule that it's not in line with that, it makes a lot of sense, right? You can't claim territory based on manufactured sort of islands, right? You can agree with that principle, but what to do about it and whether that might escalate a larger sort of conflict between two nuclear powers, the two largest economies, I think is something to really weigh heavily on and to moderate. And to, just final thought is that, right, I think discussion about China has now gotten so, so much of American politics has been polarized, right? But China is one of the few issues where there's actually not healthy debate. I think there's actually a bipartisan sort of consensus around the confrontation. And I don't think that it's actually healthy, right? Because it'll gloss over potential, nuances in these complicated sort of foreign policy matters and lead us potentially astray and end up in potential crises that could have been avoided. So to think about that would be my third takeaway. Sorry to be long-winded there. Thank you so much for your attention, and Greg for your questions in this conversation.
And thank you, Dr. Zhang. That was a very, very excellent presentation, and we appreciate your knowledge and your sharing that with us. I'm going to turn this over to Evan, who will conclude for the evening.
Well, thank you so much, Jack. Thank you so much, Greg, for your time you dedicated this evening, for the thoughtful points you made throughout the program, and for piquing our curiosity to continue to explore this topic more. We really appreciate it, and thank you everyone who gave some of your time tonight to enjoy this program. And please remember, if you'd like to review this program or any of our past programs, please head to our YouTube channel, and you can see a bunch of programs that deal with similar matters and others that we've done here in the recent past. Just like to put in a quick plug for a couple programs. Next week, we're going to be joined by the Paraguayan ambassador to the United States for a luncheon program on Thursday, February 7th at noon at Lydia's, the Italian restaurant in Kansas City. That should be a very special opportunity to welcome the ambassador from Paraguay. And then on August 12th, or excuse me, August, I'm getting far ahead of myself, April 12th, we'll be welcoming Gary Espinoz, who will be touching on the situation in Ukraine. He's a senior lecturer and regional program director lead for Europe with the Institute for Security Governance, Defense Secretary Cooperation, the DSCA. He'll be discussing the situation in Ukraine. So please join us for those programs and more. Greg, Jack, thank you again. Thank you so much, everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your evening.
Just a plug for the virtual BRI symposium and in April. Yes. That's another one if you're curious about Asia or China.
Absolutely. Thank you for reminding me. Please head to our website for any of those and more. So we'll see you all soon and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.